I will stop sharing. And Jake, you may now go ahead and get started.
All right, cool. So welcome to my part of this showcase. My name is Jake Patty, and I've been doing research this semester with Dr. Joshua Werner, Mining Engineering Department. What that laboratory focuses on, it's the Sustainable Materials and Recovery Technologies Lab, and it focuses on finding environmentally friendly ways to recycle electronic waste. And specifically for me this semester, my job was to focus on nickel metal hydride batteries. So recently, batteries from early models of hybrid electric vehicles have begun to reach the end of their lifespan in energy storage, but since they're not considered hazardous waste, they can be landfilled. The issue here is there's good economic incentive to not landfill the batteries, but to recycle them as long as a process can be developed which can economically feasibly recycle them and which can be friendly to the environment. And before that process can be developed, there had to be an in-depth analysis of the components of these batteries. And specifically, we had to find out whether or not it was worth it to recycle the batteries. And so my primary objective this semester in the short term was to perform an assay to determine the composition of a battery and then analyze the results for economic incentive in metal and materials recovery. And then in the long term, the objective is to develop that environmentally friendly and economically feasible process for hydrometallurgical recovery of valuable materials from the batteries. So there were really three main components of this in terms of what I did. And the first one was battery disassembly. And before I could analyze anything about the composition of the batteries, we had to take them apart. And so at the top right of this poster, you can see what that process looked like. We have a single battery pack, and then we have basically the top of the battery pack taken off, and then the battery cell outside of the pack, and then some booklets, because the way the battery was arranged, it was sort of a booklet formation where cathode pieces and anode pieces were intertwined. And the idea of disassembling the battery was that we wanted to find the composition, not just of the battery as a whole, but of the component parts. So we wanted to see where, what the valuable materials were, yes, but specifically also where in the battery the valuable materials were. To do this, I had to digest these component parts, and that meant that I had to take a representative sample of each, get it to as fine of a grain as possible, and then roast it to expel organics and moisture. After that, the samples were digested using aqua regia and then diluted to a 1 sample with distilled water. The assay itself meant that the samples that I had, the dilute samples, were sent to the Center for Applied Energy Research, where an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry assay was completed. And whenever the data was sent back to me, I had to process it into Excel to find basically what the data meant, because whenever the data was sent to me, everything was in parts per million of the samples that I sent. And ultimately what I found was that the most abundant elements in the batteries were aluminum, manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, and neodymium. And the top graphic here in my results section shows the mass percent of each element within each specific component of the battery. The bottom graphic shows the distribution percent of each element within each specific component of the battery. And the distribution percent it's a common metric used in mining, but it can generally be thought of as the concentration of an element in a component relative to its total presence in the whole. So it just shows how present an element is in a component. The most important part of this process that I went through was actually the economic analysis. And so I'm trying to zoom in on this part of the poster. So it's fine to see where all the elements are in the battery, and it's fine to see like what the distribution is. But ultimately here, we're trying to develop a process to recover the material from the battery. And so we had to find out about how much each material would be worth per battery. And what we ultimately found was that the nickel was worth the most. Even though there was mostly iron within the battery, nickel was still the highest value whenever you incorporated how much of it was in the battery. And then that line, just in descending order within the battery, the nickel was worth the most, then cobalt, then the neodymium, then the praseodymium, then the lanthanum, then the cesium or the cerium, then the manganese, then the aluminum. And ultimately the total the total value of the battery came out to about $5.95 per battery cell. And as I've said before, ultimately the goal of what I'm doing in this department and in this lab is to develop a process which will recover the valuable materials. Nickel and cobalt are our primary concerns. And so the next steps of this project will be a series of leaching experiments with an environmentally benign lixiviant with the goal of the selective extraction of these economically incentivized elements. And I will actually be beginning that sometime in early June, I think, with preliminary leaching experiments. And yeah, that's just what's next for me. This semester has been pretty crazy, but I would like to thank the Smart Lab team, Dr. Werner, Dr. Grappo, Peja, and Lucas Bertucci for welcoming me onto the team. And then I'd also like to thank the Chellgren Center staff for all their support this academic year. Also my parents. Hi, Mom. I know you're here. Thanks.
Got to get those kudos into the mom.
Yeah.
Good job. Good job. Thank you, Jake. If anybody has any questions, you may unmute since we are a small group, or you may put them in the chat and I can read them for you.
May I ask a question first?
You may. Go ahead, Dr. Kramer.
Very nice job. I'm always frightened when I come to these student presentations and I realize how much I don't know and how sophisticated you students are. So my question may be kind of naive, but when you went through the dollar figures, it didn't strike me that there's a lot of money to be made in recycling the batteries. And I'm wondering, is that part of the problem of any kind of recycling? Is that there has to be a worth to it, otherwise you just throw them in the trash?
Yes, actually, so whenever I showed this image, so we have the graph. Well, now it doesn't want to move. There we go. Okay, so if you can see at the top right here, whenever I say one cell, that refers to like one individual cell within the battery pack. So if you multiply that times 6, that's about $36 in a battery pack. And there's 24 of those battery packs I think that's per Prius. It might be 48 per Prius. But the idea here is that you have to think in terms of like the entire industry. So like in general, for one car, that may not be worth it. But if you have like several thousand like Priuses that are going dead every year, it scales up pretty nicely. And whenever electric vehicles in general become more popular, I mean, Tesla's already becoming popular, but in general, it's pretty expected that it'll be similar batteries all the way across. And as time goes on, this will only become more economically incentivized.
I have a question, and I apologize. I jumped on a little bit late, so you might have covered this. But so for recycling, as you mentioned, are you recycling the same battery from the electric vehicle? Is that the goal, or can you look for other material sources of these materials from other electronic spent sources?
Yeah, that's a great question. Nickel metal hydride batteries are pretty common all across electronics. And ultimately, the idea is that we do want to develop a process that works for all of them. Prius batteries are just really abundant, so they make a really good case study.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question. Is this so I know that like most of the time it's like you would just heat these up to a high amount. Is that the main part in this, or do you use other chemicals, or how does the process go exactly?
Okay, that's also a great question. So the issue with metallurgical processes, which is like what you describe as like heating up metals to like really high temperatures, is that it requires a lot of energy to do that. And that means a high operating cost for whatever kind of facility would be doing that. The processes that we're working on in this lab all really focus on hydrometallurgical processes. So the idea is that we want to use something that's water-based to strip elements out of whatever we're looking at. So for example, ammonia works really well to leach copper out of whatever copper may be in. And so we work a lot with ammonia. There are other lixiviants, but ammonia is what we mainly focus on in this lab. And ultimately, the idea is that we can pull out whatever valuable materials we need with ammonia and maybe some other elements that might be in the ammonia. But eventually, there will have to be some sort of solvent liquid extraction to actually extract the material. But that's farther down the processing step ladder.
More research to come, right? Okay, good job. Thank you very much, Jake. Let me ask just a logistics question. So you heard everybody coming in because you're co-host, right? Okay.
Yes.
Give me just a moment and let me remove that access so that does not interrupt you all. Okay, hang on just a
That would
second.
be amazing.
Yeah, I saw you move a couple times. I'm like, oh, you can hear that because you're co-host. Okay, just a second, everybody.
Thank you.
You did a great job. I will give you everybody share access to do your screen when it's your turn, but let's take this off so we don't have. So Sophia, I think that has everybody. We have a very good audience. Okay. So our next presenter is Sophia Gonzalez. Sophia, you may get started anytime.
When I'm trying to share the screen, it says the host disabled participants from screen sharing.
Oh, hang on just a second.
Okay.
There you go. Now try. I can do it a different way. Let's start your time now.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Sophia Gonzalez. For the past semester, I've been working with Dr. Zental in his lab with the psychology department. I'm going to be talking about loss aversion and gain attraction by pigeons, or in other words, risk preference of pigeons. Our research does follow a range of theories of different disciplines, but I want to shed light on one economic theory, which is known as prospect theory. Prospect theory follows how a person's decisions become more or less risk prone, based on losses and gains. The purpose of these experiments is to explore the risk preference of pigeons and to question if pigeons show a tendency to be risk averse when the decision involves potential gains, but are risk prone when the decision involves potential losses. If you take notice of the diagram, I can zoom in on it. I'm not sure how well that showed up for you guys, but we'll just go with it. So this diagram shows how the experiments were set up, and the top one will follow the loss aversion test, and the bottom ones will show the gains attraction test. So for our first experiment, it tests loss aversion. The pigeon is shown 6 pellets, 3 pellets per the risky or safe side. If the safe side is chosen by the pigeon, it will consistently receive 2 pellets. If the risky side is chosen, the pigeon is given either 1 or 3 pellets. For each trial, the pigeon always receives an average payoff of 2 pellets. And then for our second experiment, it has a very similar setup to the first experiment, except it tests gain attraction. So the safe side will still have, the pigeon will still receive only 2 pellets. Oh, and they're both shown only 1 pellet at the beginning, sorry. And if the pigeon chooses the risky side, the pigeon receives 1 or 3 pellets, and then it also has an average payoff of 2 pellets. So for our study, we've predicted 2 possible outcomes. The first being that the pigeon just chooses at random, really, and the data would be inconsistent for either side. And our second prediction followed if psychologically not losing anything half the time is better than losing twice as much the other half of the time. So the results from our first experiment, the pigeons showed a clear preference for the risky alternative, meaning that they would prefer to take more risks when they feel that they're losing a pellet during their exchange. And then our second experiment showed that pigeons did not show a consistent preference, meaning they were less risk prone when the exchange gave the illusion that they were gaining a pellet. So far, the results of both experiments are subject to framing effects predicted by prospect theory. This just shows that the pigeons are similar to humans and tend to be risk prone when they are faced with potential losses, but not risk averse when it comes to gains. We're hoping to continue this study, I believe, this summer or in the fall. I'm not sure yet. And we'll be testing some type of combination of both experiments presented. And I'm not sure what my time is, but I'd like to say special thanks to Dr. Zental and all the students that have participated in this event, or not this event, the study, sorry. I believe Shelby and Durrani are here, so that's nice of them. And I'd also like to say thanks to the Chellgren program as well. So thank you all for coming, and I suppose I can be open to questions.
Very good. Thank you, Sophia. That was really great. I like your poster. It's really good too. Design. Does anyone have any questions for Sophia? You may unmute and ask live, or you may type in the chat box.
I do have a question, Sophia. There was a time in Kramer's life when he was 2, trying to uncrack the mind of the pigeon.
Yes.
And as I think back, and it's really kind of intriguing how smart pigeons are. And they don't have a lot of sort of stuff up there in that little head. So it means you can be pretty smart without having, a huge brain. But I'm kind of interested in what the comparative similarities or differences might be. So are there other species besides pigeons and humans that the pattern kind of holds for, or are there any for which it does not hold?
Yes, so we actually, our experiment is based off of another experiment, I think by Santos, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce the other name, but they actually tested this in monkeys. And we're testing it in pigeons because it kind of can show how unique this specific feature is to humans, I guess. So we did find similarities to that study as well as with humans. So far on the list, yes, humans, monkeys, and pigeons are following this theory.
Sophia, I have a question. It's always tough to figure out who's next on these Zoom things. My question is, my knowledge of psychology is limited, but one thing that maybe stood out to me, and maybe it's just not feasible with this experiment, is that what would happen if you had an example where there's a larger gain or a greater loss, instead of one pellet giving 2, maybe one pellet giving 10, and then vice versa. You could lose a lot in a riskier situation and have a more, less of a loss in the other one.
Right. I'm not exactly sure how that would go. It's like for the pigeons, but I will say this, with our experiments in either scenario, they never actually lose anything or gain anything. It's the exact amount at the same time, like in full, it's the same amount. So it just gives them the illusion that they're gaining or losing. So, I mean, it would probably give similar results if they still were actually gaining or losing more or less.
Okay. Thanks.
So you said that like the pigeons were placed in 2 cases, one where they had a more risky choice and one where they could play it safe. How did like the pigeons know their choice was going to be more risky in that case?
Okay, so we use a actual like physical apparatus. So one side is painted red and the other is green. And I'll do the loss aversion one. So there is one pellet shown to them on either side. And then we will only show them those. And then one side is just determined as the risky side. So one of the colors. So we'll just pull back the other slides to show them how many they got each time.
Okay, awesome.
All right, good job, Sophia. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Really great. You had plenty of time. Okay, so our next presenter is Emily. Let me show your slide, and then you can show your slide, your next slide. Okay, so Emily Guerrero.
Yep.
All right, and you may share, and don't forget to, you've unmuted, so you're good to go, and your time starts now.
Sorry. Okay. Okay. So hi everyone. My name is Emily Guerrero, and I will be representing the craft laboratory today. We've been working on an interdisciplinary project with the College of Medicine and the School of Music to begin using data sonification as a learning tool in understanding molecular concepts. So firstly, students coming from certain demographics, such as first generation, low income, women, people of color, and people with disabilities are underrepresented in STEM-related careers. And additionally, there's also an overall decline in students' interest for pursuing future studies in the STEM field. Therefore, authentic learning experiences have become necessary to increase overall involvement. And one way of introducing an authentic learning experience to be able to engage students' interest in STEM is by incorporating the arts, so converting STEM into STEAM to connect with students on a creative level and improve students' overall engagement, confidence, and creativity. The overarching question that we're looking at is how can we make molecular biology resonate with students? And this is done with data sonification. So data sonification is a method of converting information to sound that provides a tangible understanding of protein mutations and disruptions through a musical representation. And for this project, we'll be looking at proteins associated to Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder that is usually sporadic, but can be caused by genetic mutations as well. And there are 5 major proteins that have mutations associated to the progression of this disease, including the LRRK2 protein, Parkin protein, DJ1 protein, alpha-synuclein, and PINK1 protein. And for the methods, we begin using the UniPort protein database for finding protein sequences and structures. And in this image, it shows the alpha-synuclein protein and its amino acid sequence that we use to find in this database. And then next, we place the protein sequences into a Excel file that tests the hydrophobicity index of each amino acid that then constructs both a neutral wild type protein and a mutant protein with known associated Parkinson's mutations. And then as for the music mapping methods, these sequences are translated into music patterns based on their individual hydrophobicity index of each amino acid, and they are mapped according to notes on a given music scale and by rhythm, where the index value indicates how many notes per beat. And here is an example of data sonification of a LRRK2 protein. So LRRK2 is responsible for mitochondrial functioning in the neuronal cell and includes 2 autosomal dominant mutations that are associated to Parkinson's by causing damage to the nerve cells. And here you can see an audible representation in the distortion of the music, indicating the occurrence of a mutation in the sequence. And this is a second example of data sonification on alpha-synuclein, which shows the distortion of 4-point mutations in the sequence. And again, you can see the distortion in the music pattern indicating the mutation's effects on the protein. Overall, the purpose of using data sonification is to provide a virtual learning tool in understanding complex proteins through music patterns that provide students of various backgrounds with an authentic learning experience to improve engagement in STEM. And our future plans for this project is to introduce this method of learning to students in a classroom setting. So beginning with middle school and high school students, part of the Outreach Start program. And we are also using data sonification with other diseases involving associated protein mutations such as sickle cell anemia, ALS, and other disorders. And finally, I'd like to thank and give acknowledgements to our team of interdisciplinary students, our cross-college mentors, and the overall funding for this program, and also the Chellgren program for contributing. Thank you so much, and I'll open up to questions now.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, you may unmute or put in the chat.
Yeah, so is the goal of this to like, so that the students hear a note and then understand it to be a certain protein or amino acid, and then they can learn one by hearing the other? Is that the general
Yes.
outline for it?
Yeah, so the purpose in using the music patterns is to be able to, for students to have an easier way of understanding complex proteins. So if you give a student a understanding of like a really complex protein such as synuclein, just giving them the protein, they wouldn't really be able to depict where the mutation is occurring or really understand that kind of level of protein mutations, I guess. And then if you show them a audible representation through music, they'll be able to understand that that's the occurrence of a mutation. And for like that alpha synuclein, they'd see that that's a difference in the music patterns, and that would be a misfolding in that specific protein.
Awesome, cool.
Dr. Kramer?
Emily, fascinating stuff. Combining deep biology and music is itself just a fascinating concept. But I'm wondering, and I don't fully understand, of course, much of this very complicated topic, but why is it that the mutations sound weird? Is it that they are, I mean, some mutations, if you look at evolutionary history, end up being advantageous. So would they sound real good? Or is that too simplistic a way to think of this?
Well, there's also the analogy that we made in a different presentation that's like a symphony. So technically when we put in the mutation, there's supposed to be a distortion and difference, because overall when there's like the neutral protein, the regular protein doesn't have any differences. It doesn't have any distortion in the music. And then when you translate it and put it in with the mutation, there's going to be an obvious difference, and there's going to be a change in the sound, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I just have one comment on that too. I find this very fascinating. I haven't seen anything like this probably ever. I know, I mean, I had a project once in which we did a similar thing to use genetic sequence alignments to actually identify ancient Greek texts by just swapping out amino acids and Greek characters. But this I just find fascinating to actually be able to listen to an audio representation of this complex issue. And I immediately thought that you could probably, machine learning models would probably understand this better based on the sound representation than the actual visual data of this. Because the patterns are very easier to detect in music.
And also this project is fairly new. So we're still trying to develop like new ways of converting the music and the patterns and translating them into protein sequence, like the sequences into music patterns. So this entire concept is fairly new and we're still working on it.
Good job. Thank you very much, Emily. That was really good. Okay, we're going to move on to our next. We have a comment from Dr. Bradley that says, super job, Emily. Let me share my screen. We'll move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Cameron Brewer. Okay. Let me stop my sharing, and Cameron, you should be able to now share your screen.
Let's see. Okay.
Your mute is off.
Good afternoon. My name is Cameron Brewer. I'm an undergraduate researcher in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. I have been working under the mentorship of Dr. Sophia Gonzalez, and today we're just going to be walking through my research, observing and calculating the effective permeability of heat shields through the method of simulation. So before we step into looking at it through simulation, I think it's important to look at what are heat shields in the physical. So a heat shield, it is a porous, permeable material that is placed on the front of the spacecraft as the spacecraft is re-entering the atmosphere. And so this material, the purpose of it is to diffuse both heat and gas throughout the material in order to lessen the impact on the nose of the material. And the most common material used for this is a carbon-carbon composite. The reason that this material is chosen is because of the mechanical properties of this material are the pinnacle of materials in terms of high temperature operation. So they will preserve their properties of impact and their strength at incredibly high temperatures. As well as the reason that a carbon-carbon composite is chosen is because the carbon in this material will react with the oxygen in the atmosphere in an endothermic reaction, which will additionally aid in the cooling of the surface of these space capsules as they go through the process of reentry. So now that we've talked about heat shields in the physical, I'll talk a little bit more about digitally rendering them and how we look at simulating them. So we use a technique called direct simulation Monte Carlo, or DSMC. And what this is it's derived from something called Sparta Sandia, and it is a solver of the Boltzmann equation. And so what this does is it seeks to describe the fluid as it flows through our membrane, through our carbon composite network. And so direct simulation Monte Carlo will model the gas particles through collisions. So whether these collisions be through other gas particles or with the network itself, it will look at each given time step and break it down into frames and move each gas particle over the given time and observe possible collisions, either with, as I said before, other gas particles or with the material itself. And so what our results in these simulations have found is that they are more accurate at higher pressure and lower temperature, as well as at lower temperature than higher pressure. This, by the way, is compared to the experiments of Marshall and Milos. They are researchers with the Ames Research Center at NASA. And the reason that this is because at higher pressure and lower temperature, the gas becomes less rarefied. And so our assumption of a continuum flow starts to break down at a lower pressure and incredibly high temperatures. And going into more my role in this, my role has been to convert the output file of the simulation, to convert this into a legible file that can be plotted by visualization software. So you can see the image in the bottom middle it's a vector plot generated by that visualization software. And it is able to plot after going through the translation to this other style of code. TechPlot is an app that will actually plot out these collisions. And so you can see the vectors are changing more in the middle of that region because that's where the microstructure is located. And so additionally, my role in this research has been to, Dr. Puvathingal and I have been working on creating a MATLAB code that will find the change of the permeability of this material as it is consistently reacting with the oxygen and more additional material is being added. And so you can see on the left, this is an image generated by the MATLAB software we've been using. And it has created this almost a stickiness or this, this binding between the fibers, which ultimately changes the permeability of the material. And so for future research, what we're going to be looking into is the equation that we used to actually solve for the effective permeability is an equation called the Klinkenberg equation. And adding a higher order term to this equation, we believe can rectify this discrepancy over various pressures, and hopefully it'll put us in the correct continuum flow region that will allow for accurate, highly accurate results over all pressures and temperatures. So just some challenges that we faced included that discrepancy and recognizing that we do have to add an additional term to that equation, as well as working in MATLAB. Dr. Pavathangel and I just have been trying to experiment around with the image processing toolbox in MATLAB, something that we're both kind of working with and trying to grow more familiar with. And real quick, I just want to talk about the impact of direct simulation Monte Carlo. This does not just have impact for the aerospace community, but for example, someone at the Maxwell Reed seminar just a couple weeks ago described how they're using a similar technique, not with gas particles, but with radiation. And so they're using it to target specific cancer cells. And so using lasers, they're able to model the flow of these photons as they go and kill cancer cells, as opposed to just a wider range of cells. And an additional use of direct simulation Monte Carlo that's been pretty widely used is for shale deposits. And it has a pretty big environmental impact that can be seen as the natural gas is able to seep out of the ground. And so you can see the leakage of natural gas over time, and it can be simulated very quickly using direct simulation Monte Carlo. So we believe that this method of simulation will be critically important going into the future for porous materials and for calculating permeability. Are there any questions that anybody would like to talk about?
You can either put your questions in the chat or just unmute. Dr. Kramer, you have a question?
I'll try. I mean, I don't even know what to ask. This is far above my little pea head, but it's fascinating again, and kudos to you. Let me try to phrase it this way. You're dealing both with a really complicated technological question, but then also, heavy duty mathematics. What drives you in this? Is it more the deep mathematics of it, or is it the actual end result in terms of the application?
So one of the things with the research that has really taken me by surprise is the level of software that Dr. Pavathangel and I have had to work with. And I'm involved in mechanical engineering as well as electrical engineering. And so I'm just really interested in the collaboration of these two with software, rendering the physical, and being able to come up with solutions in the digital or the metaverse to be applied to the physical. So I think the research that Dr. Pavathangel is doing to really further this, and yeah, I think it'll be really important going into the future.
Hi, Cam, I have a question. So I know with simulations, it's a matter of what you put into the simulator, the information you get out. And you talked about oxygen, molecular oxygen, and but the atmosphere is made up of many different, a mixture of gases. So does that enter into your simulation? And then would that, and is that important? It may not be important or it might be minimal, but you max out your computational power for, a very minor component. But would this be useful for looking at other planets? And that might have a different atmosphere altogether.
Yeah, it actually is. That's a great question. It's really important. So one of the elements that we've been working on most with has been argon, and built into the Sparta code, you are able to define different varieties of elements. And so you can create these different variable mixtures that will have different amounts of elements in them. So you can determine the percent, the fraction of the atmosphere that will be made up of these different elements. And it will, so it works through a stochastic generation of these gas particles. And so it'll randomly generate the particles as they're, before they collide with one another. And so yes, to that question, it is able to observe a very wide variety of gases. And that's a part of the code that I've been working on, is how do we interpret that from the output data to then be presented in the visualization software. It has to be able to make that discrepancy before it gets translated into the visualization.
Great
Thank you.
job.
Very impressive. Thank you.
Thank you, Cam. We're going to move on to our next presenter. Just a moment, let me show your title screen. And everybody help me welcome Ian Metzger. Ian, you should be able to share your screen and
Okay. Yes.
unmute yourself. Your time starts now.
There we are. Hi. So my name is Ian Metzger, and my research involved building an ancient Greek medical dictionary. And so I did this with Dr. Bruce Suelis in the Department of Computer Science. And so the goal of this research was to lay out the foundation for creating an online dictionary resource for medical terms in ancient Greek. And the reason we chose this is because I am both interested in medicine and history, and Dr. Bruce Suelis has done work in the digital humanities. And then so while some of these dictionaries exist, none of them are specifically devoted to ancient medical terminology, and especially terms that are preserved on ancient papyri fragments. So my role consisted of finding and processing the data that exists. And this was mainly done using papyri.info, which, as you can see in figure 1, is an online resource that has taken these papyri fragments and translated them from Greek to English, and they also include the text in Greek. And so I had to sort through this data, and I did that by 2 main searches. The first one was a medical and prescriptions search, as seen in figure 3. And the second one was a medical and treatise search. And so from that, what I was looking for is whether or not the papyri fragments had any specific information that we could use. And in that, I mean specific Greek medical terms. And so I organized the data based on the body part that was referenced. And so as you can see in figure 3, the eye was one of the most frequently referenced body parts. And so we focused on, we initially focused on building the online dictionary around those fragments that contain that. And then so as you can see in figure 2, this is the raw XML files that show where they where the ancient Greek is. And so because of this, and because that exists, we could reasonably create a prototype dictionary of these ancient Greek medical terms. And so from that, what we have just started doing is parsing out these XML files to find the specific Greek words that are used in them, and be able to isolate that and to use wireframes to start developing a online Python or Django application. And then possibly in the future, one of the things we've thought of is, because some of these Greek terms that are found in the papyri fragments are not widely used, we would need to crowdsource to engage with medical professionals to be able to assist and define these terms. And then a future goal in that would be to use the same model, specifically focusing on ancient medical terminology to use for other ancient languages, such as Latin or Egyptian or Akkadian. And so I would specifically like to thank Dr. Bruce Suelis for taking me on late in the semester to do this, as I have loved to learn more about medicine and the digital humanities. So thank you all. And are there any questions?
Great job, Ian. Sounds very
Thank you.
interesting. I'm glad you were able to mix the two interests together.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question, or I really think it's cool what, that you were able to blend the CS and the medicine. I agree. Okay, any questions?
I have a question.
Okay, Sophia.
I just wanted to know, like, what's the timeline of like conducting this experiment? Because I imagine it'd take a lot of, like, I don't know, since it's so specific to certain things, like how long does it take you to translate?
Well, so me specifically, I don't have any background in computer science. So it's been a huge learning curve. But we have just started to parse out the XML and to start to create that. But we have a lot more steps down the line, because ideally we would want to set up a way for medical professionals to be able to help to accurately define all of these terms, and that could take a long time. So
Okay. Well, that was really good. Thank you for answering that.
thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask a real quick, basic question, Ian?
Yeah,
I
sure.
don't know the answer to this. It may not be that basic, but if you look at medical terminology, are there more terms that derive from Latin than Greek, or are they equal, or is there Greek terminology more?
I actually do not know the answer to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna follow, actually, I was along the lines of my
Or
question.
Greek.
Okay.
There you go.
So, yeah. There
But
is
other,
actually more.
yeah, but other languages, would this be applicable? It seems like it would to, like other, is there a type of language that would be, does it have to be, Greek or Latin based? It looks like it could be across, even, I'm thinking of Native American languages, things along those lines. Is that possible? Even though those aren't written, a lot of them?
Yes. So one of the reasons why we chose Greek was specifically there's a lot of information that has like all of the papyri fragments have been in Greek, and they've found those. And then so there's not a lot of that with, for instance, the Native American languages. So we have a lot less data to work with, and then so it would be harder, but the same process could take place.
Yeah, that's those certainly the spoken languages that are disappearing. A lot of those are
Yes.
be a great tool for capturing that information.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ian. Good job.
Thank
Our
you.
next presenter, let me show your title screen, please. It's Miss Kaitlynn Albers. Welcome, Kaitlynn.
Thank you.
You should be able to share your screen now. You are unmuted and you may begin anytime.
Okay. Okay. So this semester, I worked with Dr. James Hertog to do research over candidates for public office, perception of news coverage over them. He works in the School of Journalism at the University of Kentucky. And so this is a topic that he has actually been researching over the years. So I was really interested on taking on this topic because I myself am a journalism major and a political science minor. So these go hand in hand, and I have plans to go to law school. So I really wanted to do something that I thought would really just be around my interest and what I'm pursuing to do in the future. And I've always had, because of how polarized the climate is now, I'm very interested in how the news media plays a role in today's political climate. So it was a very relevant topic for myself. And as we know, it's very much right versus left right now in the United States. And the news media, there's this perception that it's not trusted by much of the public. And so my question was, well, do public candidates also view it this way? Do they have a lack of trust for the news media ever since the phenomenon of fake news has really taken off? So because I wanted to see how different types of candidates view the news media performance and covering their campaigns, I really wanted to pay special attention to the aspects that might influence this perspective. So how they identify politically, race, gender, and all these types of aspects, and if that plays a role into how they see the work of the news media. I'm also interested in if how a candidate performs, if that then reflects their perception of the news media. And so to do this, we sent out a web survey so we went on to every state and we would look at political candidates across the board at all levels. And we send out a web survey to anybody that we can contact, and we collect this information. And then we want to categorize it and evaluate the data and kind of form conclusions on how different types of candidates, and after we analyze the person and evaluate the type of person who sent back the response, we then kind of put them in categories to see what types of people feel certain ways about how the news media covers their campaigns and what aspects influence that. And so my predictions for this was that if a candidate wins an election, they would be more likely to approve of the news coverage that was over his or her campaign. And because of this last administration's, the Trump administration's emphasis on fake news, I perceive that right-wing politicians are less likely to approve of news coverage than left-wing politicians, just because of how normally because if the Trump administration was more right-wing, that means they're more like-minded to right-wing politicians, that more of them are not going to trust the news and push that it is a dishonest industry. And because of how relevant this is, I also perceive that candidates are less likely to trust the media now than they did in the past. And that's really specifically because of there's so many different outlets now, and anybody can put out information with social media. And there's such a competitive and intense industry surrounding journalism to be the first one to get the news information out there, that there is less verification of the news, and more people can comment on it, so mistakes are caught faster. So the flaws in the news industry are a lot more transparent than ever before. And that's just because of the competitive nature and how many more news industries there are out there. And so for the continuing of this project, so far what we know is that race, gender, they don't seem to really influence how candidates view the news media's work. They tend to have, across the board, we don't see a lot of differences in that, but that's only what we know so far, because we are waiting on collecting more responses and getting as many as we can, so we can have a wider range of responses to categorize. And so after we do this, we'll analyze them, and we're going to record these results over the summer, and we're going to begin detailing this process in a research journal and really going forward with it. So far, it's been a very valuable learning experience because I'm super interested in this. It's been super helpful. Both my mentor and I, we wanted to do a lot more over winter break, but because of some personal issues that arose with him and then later me, it definitely set us back a little bit, which is why, but I'm really thankful that he is willing to stick this out with me despite some of the experiences that we had this semester, to continue over the summer, because I really want to learn more about this and do it. And so I'm very excited to continue. And we put as much time as we could into it this semester, but we have a lot more work to do this summer. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the Chellgren program for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Kaitlynn.
Kaitlynn, let me ask you a question, and you may not know the answer to this, but I'm interested in whether the phenomenon of fake news is more intense at the national level, or do you see it throughout, like in state elections and even local elections?
I would say that as of now, it is more intense at the national level, because that's where it was really pushed the hardest at first, and by more national figures. I would say that would trickle down and start to affect local news more strongly later, but people tend to trust, the anchors that they're more familiar with and that they seem closer with, somebody that seems more personal to them and within their own communities. But at the national scale, I would say it's a lot more distrusting, but because that's going to spread across the nation faster, it'll definitely probably trickle down to smaller organizations.
I have a quick question. So as political figures start rising and become more under public scrutiny, does their perception of media change as they become a more public figure, or just the public is holding them more accountable?
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions in the survey that I'm really interested to see, because I would predict that yes. I would say that they're going to dislike the news media a lot more once a public figure is under so much more scrutiny, because they are going, anything that they don't want to be aired to the public might be, because it's the role of journalism in the country to hold people of power accountable. And so when they may not like that if it's in a negative light. So the more scrutiny they face, they're probably going to dislike the news media for putting that out there for more to see.
Well, thank you.
I have a question. It's kind of related to what we're talking about, but with news channels being so split with political parties and everything, do you think that a neutral bias would ever, as a news channel, would ever be successful or possible?
That's a really That's a hard question to answer because I feel like the more news media, wherever there's a business and an industry for, that's where you're going to see the next news media pop up. So whatever side they feel like is not being represented and they feel like there's a market for, I feel like those are the news industries that tend to pop up to cater to those people. But I do, I can't but think that people do want the truth more than they want to hear a side of anything, and that I could definitely see the trend going towards a very unbiased, neutral stance, because I think a lot of people want that and they would want to tune into that. So I could definitely see that happening, maybe not super soon, but in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Kaitlynn? Okay, thank you, Kaitlynn.
Thank you.
You can stop sharing. I will share Shauna's title slide. Our next presenter, please welcome Shauna Kitts.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Give me just a second. I want to share my screen. All right. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my work over the past, it wasn't just the semester, it was the whole school year, but I worked with Dr. Miller in the College of Social Work, and we looked at the self-care practices of television journalists, particularly in the era of COVID. So COVID affected people of all professions, but Dean Miller didn't really believe there was like a whole lot of research done into burnout among television journalists. Television journalists are experiencing a lot of trauma at this point in time. Everyone is, it is a collective trauma. But we feel that because they're getting all of the exposure to it, and then their job is to deliver that news, that it was important to see how they're caring for themselves with such a stressful job at this point in time. So the methods for this, I got to be along for the whole ride. It was exciting, but this meant submitting to the IRB and sending out the survey, which was our primary tool for data collection, was a survey sent out to television journalists across the country. So we used this one website that showed every single news station broken down by state, region, city, etc. Then we would, once we found each news channel, we would go to their website. There's usually some type of page that says like meet our team or meet the anchors, something along those lines. And we would email them the survey. It's an 18, so our methods were the survey, it's an 18-item questionnaire, sent it to people across the country. And we asked these journalists to reflect on their self-care before and during COVID. Self-care is kind of a buzzword right now. In my field, which is social work, it is really important. It's really being stressed by employers to take care of oneself. You're seeing a lot on social media that's important to care for yourself. And, you know, there's also now a stereotype associated with like bubble baths, things like that. But we asked television journalists to reflect on their self-care before and during COVID. And then we assess these results using a paired samples t-test, which is this data table I have right here. That's just comparing two things, pre-COVID, post-COVID. So they're broken down into two different scores. They are personal self-care and their professional self-care. It's rated amongst 0 to 36. Closer to 36 is more self-care. Closer to 0 is poorer self-care habits. As you can see here, before COVID, journalists thought they were, kind of not right in the middle, but doing a little bit better with their self-care. Personally, professional self-care, you can see the mean is at 18.66. That's almost smack dab in the middle. And then you can see during the era of COVID that these numbers do drop significantly, and that the average personal self-care level is 18.4, and that's a drop of about 5 points. So their self-care has been debilitated. So after the survey, our initial findings were that their self-care practices have been negatively impacted by COVID. And we think to curb this burnout that there are a few more things that need to be done, particularly promoting self-care in the workplace by the employer, as well as seminars dedicated to television journalists. And we also think that some additional research into this topic is necessary. As like Dean Miller, his purpose for doing this research was that there wasn't a whole lot of it. We think that there needs to be some more research into it. And it was a great experience. It really opened me up to research in general. And I was wonderful to work with Dean Miller. I really appreciate that he took the time to dedicate to an undergrad because he is the dean of the college. So I think that was the coolest part of this experience. And I really appreciate the people and the Chellgren program who got me here. So I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna.
Hey, Shauna, interesting project. My question is more speculative, that it's been a rough year in many ways. So not only the COVID, but correlated with it has been a series of very public events, very negative, and it's been just tough to participate in the real world, so to speak. So I'm wondering if there's any way that you could actually tease out the direct impact of COVID from the other ancillary events that were co-occurring with it, like the number of police shootings, for example, that very high profile cases. The news was very tough to watch.
Yes, I agree. I think that's definitely playing into it. Like, as you said, it's really affecting everyone negatively. I'm not really sure like how we could isolate like how this specific event is affecting professionals. But like COVID is kind of like an umbrella term for the series of unfortunate events of the past year and a half or so. So I'm not really sure. I think I think going into people's social media would probably say a lot about them. People share a lot of things on the internet, and these are great tools to look back on. So maybe seeing how their posts, if they're positive or negative at the time, and then maybe trying to control for like their life events, like if there's a death in the family, perhaps their tone on the internet would be a bit more negative than usual, even outside of the events they're reporting on. I think that may be something interesting to look at.
Any other questions for Shauna?
Shauna, I might have missed this, but how many people were involved in your survey?
So that I don't have access to, but I would say it's probably in the thousands.
Okay.
Kind of something to do with the surveys is that you send it out to so many people and you're just throwing it and you're hoping it sticks to someone. And
Sure.
so when you send it out to so many people, you are bound to get, more than a few responses.
Yeah, maybe your response rates will maybe be information too that might help answer Dr. Kramer's questions. He replies. Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, any final questions? All right, so our next presenter is not physically here, but she prepared a video for us to watch. And I am going to share screen for her title slide. Let's welcome Marley Scholten. Then we will watch her video, I hope.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marley Scholten, and I'm a sophomore in biomedical engineering. Over the past semester, I've had the privilege to work under Dr. Simon and with 3 grad students, Mariana, Justin, and Walt. We have been exploring and comparing hip joint muscle function and cartilage health in femoral acetabular impingement syndrome patients and comparing them to a healthy control group. Femoral acetabular impingement syndrome, also known as FAIS, is an orthopedic condition that involves hip joint morphology and severe hip pain. These abnormalities include different hip joint loading patterns, hip muscle weakness, and poor cartilage health. As of now, there are no effective treatments to reduce these symptoms. My goal has been to explore the differences in hip joint mechanics, muscle strength, and cartilage health between the FAI patients and the control group. We hypothesized that the FAI patients will show weaker hip strength and poor cartilage composition compared to the controls. The ongoing study focuses on the FAI patients prior to and 1 year after hip arthroscopy surgery. We have 6 healthy patients for our control group and 7 pre-surgical FAI patients that we have gathered data from before the surgical procedure and soon to be 1 year after, with every patient being evaluated with their dominant leg. The hip strength variables that were assessed include strength from the hip flexors, extensors, abductors, and adductors. MRI imaging also provides us with data with T1 row cartilage mapping to assess hip joint cartilage health. The higher the T1 row value, the lower the proteoglycan content. In order to get these values, we have been manually performing cartilage segmentation on the MRI images using MATLAB software shown above in Figure 1. The images are divided into subregions in order to compare the data from different hip joints. Backing up the hypothesis, FAI patients overall had lower hip flexor, extensor, and abductor strength compared to the control group when shown in Figure 2. As far as the quantitative MRI data goes, the FAI group showed higher T1 row values in regions 3 through 5, shown in Figure 3. This means that they have lower proteoglycan content with their acetabular cartilage. Figure 4 shows a slightly higher T1 row values for femoral cartilage as well. In conclusion, the data found thus far supports the hypothesis made prior to this study. With more data to come post-op, we can hope the hip abnormalities can draw closer to the healthy control group after receiving the surgical treatment. My next steps in this research process is to establish my own reliability measures in order to segment hip joint cartilage and analyze the T1 row values for the 1 year post-op follow-ups to come. I'm continuing to work towards understanding the analyses that are performed with gait and how they are analyzed. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Let me get that out of here. Too many buttons. So we are finished for today. That was our last presenter, was Marley. Thanks everyone for being here. We had a great group. I love